Hey guys, welcome back to Bible Fun with the Nuns. Today we're studying 2 Kings chapter 6. Let's get started.
Okay, so whenever we started reading through this chapter just a little while ago, John and I, again, we're looking at the life and the ministry of the prophet Elisha with an S and an H. Elisha, not Elijah, Elisha. What's interesting about him is that Elisha is often known really as like a second-class prophet to Elijah, the one that came behind him. But when we start adding up all of the things that he did, he actually did double the amount of miracles and adventures that Elijah had. And so you gotta, when you're trying to figure out why, you go all the way back to the beginning of the story. Remember the story where Elijah is taken into heaven by the whirlwind. What was Elisha's one request? He said, hey, before you go, what I would like is a double portion. Whatever it means that God's hand was upon you, I want a double portion of that. And God said, and Elijah said, well, God's going to have to decide if that's something he wants to answer. Well, indeed, he does, because he has these moments. So chapter 6 really has about three main stories. And one of the comments, I thought they're going to kind of set the structure for how we look at this one chapter. John said, he said, Daddy, I read the story and I understood it, but I'm just not quite sure how to talk about all of this. And specifically, you got this latter story in the chapter about cannibalism. And I mean, it just sounds terrible, right? So I thought what we would do is we just kind of work our way through these three things and give about three takeaways and maybe connect the dots, see what happens. All right, John, what's up first?
So the first story is this dude comes up to Elisha and he says to him, hey, our houses are kind of small. Can we go to the river and cut down some trees to build a bigger house? And then he's like, sure. And then he says, hey, do you want to come too? And then Elijah agrees, and so they start walking to the river. And while they're chopping, one of the people, while he's like chopping, the head of the axe fell, it flew off and went into the river. And then he's like, oh no, my axe, it's gone. And he said, and it was like a borrowed axe too. So Elisha said, where did it like enter in the water? And so he pointed out the area. And so Elisha threw in a little stick and and out floated the axe head thing.
All right, so let's pause and let's take a couple of like what was happening and then what are some takeaways. So first of all, this was happening what's called the school of the prophets. So Elisha is a prophet. But there were like a lot of other guys who were basically prophets in training. This would be like what we would call in like our day, like seminary. These guys are learning from him. They're learning God's word. They're learning how to teach it. They're learning how to go out. And so they're young guys growing up to do the work of the ministry. And what they're figuring out is their seminary, the building they're meeting in, is so small for all the guys that are coming to know the Lord and want to serve him. They need a bigger place to meet. So they do what some churches do. They go, we got to have a building project. Well, how was their building project? Everybody was going to go out and get a tree, bring it back, and they were going to build on and then make an addition to the thing. Well, then you got the story of the axe head. Now, what I like about this, I like the fact, first of all, that Elisha is invited to go with the guys to do the work, and he agrees to it. Why? Because he's got a shepherd's heart. So a lot of times it's really easy for us to tell people what to do, but a shepherd is one who joins the sheep in the work. And so when you look at and we talk about this as our church staff a lot of times, like what's our job? Is our job to put on services? No, we do that in the function and capacity of doing our jobs. But the Bible actually tells us that we are to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. Well, if it's equipping the work of the saint or equipping the saints to do the work of the ministry, that means that not only can we instruct, but we also join in. That's what shepherds do. The other side of this is when they go to the water, the axe head falls into the water. This story has a simple need, but it's still a real need. Like just because, it's an axe. This is not a nation. This is not a king. This is not a kingdom, but it's still a need. I'm going to tell you this. Sometimes we feel like we got a need, but we don't want to share it because, it's simple. It's not as big as somebody else's need, not as bad as somebody else's trouble. And we feel like, well, it's not that bad, so why would I share it? Well, this story in the Bible tells us that even if your need feels small in the scope of everything else, if it's still a need, then it's still a need. The other thing is, I like to remember that this is not the axe head falling off of the axe isn't a sign like the guy was in sin or that he was being punished for anything. Sometimes, listen, let me let you off the hook a little bit. Sometimes the axe head just flies off and it falls in the water. Sometimes life happens. It's not judgment. It's not demons. It's not nothing. It's just life. And God is invested in those moments too. Like sometimes if you ever had one of those moments where it seems like everything that could go wrong does go wrong. And it feels like you're just like in quicksand and it just gets worse and worse and worse as it spirals down. A lot of folks feel like, man, if one more bad thing happens, I'm done. Well, what if sometimes axes break? But it doesn't mean God can't fix it. So whatever it is, whatever axe head you have that's fallen off and it's causing you a lot of like, oh no, it's a borrowed axe. What do I do? No. God can take care of you. All right. So there's another story. John, what's the next story? This is about war.
So the next story, there's a king and he's like, hey, who's the spy that's giving all of our information to their enemy? And then they're like, oh, there's no spy. It's just the holy man over there, Elisha. And then he's like, oh, you better go capture him. And so they send out a big army to attack, to capture him. But then Elisha says, strike these people down. And so, strike them blind. Yeah. So basically, just like that, they're all blind. And so he just takes the army and takes them to good guys. And they, instead of like enslaving them or killing them, they actually just feed them and like give them homes and then just let them walk away.
Because what does Jesus tell us to do with our enemy? He said, if your enemy is hungry, do what for him?
Feed them.
Feed them, right. So now here's what my quick takeaway from this story is this is another miracle of the eyes. So the servant, Elisha's servant, did not see the angels of the Lord protecting them until Elisha prayed that his eyes would be open. You know, a lot of times when people tell me their problems, you know what I typically do? I'll pray not for their eyes, I'll pray for their situation. So they'll say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. Would you pray for me? And I go, God, would you just bless them? And would you take care of this? And would you fix it? Would you help them to feel better? I'll pray all of that. But really, Elisha's prayer was a lot more powerful because he said he could have prayed, Lord, help him to feel better and not be as afraid. And if he didn't feel as afraid, that's a benefit. But how did it change his life to say, God, would you open his eyes so that he can see what I see? A lot of times I think we're grown because of our problems if God opens our eyes and we see that he's at work all around us. Well, then the next part of the story is that the enemy goes blind and then they get their sight back and then they go home. So do you remember what I talked about Sunday at church, the story of the widow's oil?
Oh, yeah.
You remember how whenever they were preparing the bowls and the jars and all that stuff, they went inside and what did they do with the door? Do you remember?
They locked it.
They shut the door behind them. So how many people could see what they were doing? Nobody. And I just made a random comment. I said, never underestimate the work that God does behind closed doors. And so I want to kind of even pull that forward into here. Never underestimate the power of what God can do even when we don't see him working. So even when my eyes don't see it, does my heart have enough faith to go, even though I can't see it, still I trust him? And then there's this last story. The last story is pretty disgusting. It's about a time of famine and it's a time of the city of Israel or the capital of Israel is being, they got enemies outside the gates. They're starving on the inside. And what was the situation?
So basically these two ladies, one lady had a son and then the other lady also had a son. And so one lady goes to the other lady and says, hey, since we don't have a lot of food, we should probably cook your son and eat him for dinner. And then the lady's like, hey, that's a good idea, which no, it's not. And so basically they do that and they eat her son. And then the next day, they're like, hey, we need to eat your son now, because that was like the deal that they had made. And but the lady who still had her son had hidden him away, and they didn't eat him.
Okay, so this part of the story actually finishes in chapter 7, and Jeb and I will get into that a little bit. or we'll wrap that up. But what I think is interesting about this story is how gross it is. Like, this is a gross story. This is about cannibalism, like eating people, but not just people, like eating their kids. This is terrible. Do you know how I think about this story when I read it? I think about the story of the prodigal son. You remember the story of the prodigal son? Where he runs away from his daddy and he loses all his money and loses everything, but he gets a job. What's his job? Do you remember? He's feeding animals on a farm. What kind of animals?
Pigs.
He's pigs. And what is he reduced to do? The only thing he can think to eat is what?
Slop.
The pig slop. And so when he's about to eat this disgusting slop, that's when he turns his eyes and he comes to this realization. He comes to himself and he comes running back to his father. When I read this story, I think this could be the story of the prodigal son before the prodigal son, because they're forced to eat this terrible situation. And they could have turned their eyes to the Lord and looked to the Lord and run to the Lord, and the Lord would have received them, but they didn't. And so the story's going to finish later, but what we have to see, like, how bad has it got to be before we start turning our eyes back to the Lord? The wise will be the ones who say, I'm not going to go too far down this terrible path. I'm going to turn to the Lord quickly. That's what I got out of the chapter. You good? You got anything else to say? All right. We'll see you tomorrow in chapter number 7. Bye.